Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode. And I rarely open a podcast by saying this interview podcast is way overdue. But I'm going to say it anyway because I have Todd Haugh with me. Todd, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Happy to be here.
Todd, you are a huge player in, I'm going to call it the compliance space, but it's really a much broader remit. And as the son of a professor, I always gravitate towards academicians. You're in that world and really a true thought leader in a wide variety of areas of business ethics, business law, compliance, and some other things that we're going to touch on today. So, could you tell our listeners about your academic and professional background?
Sure. So, first of all, thanks, Tom, for that. That's very kind of you to say. It's nice to be in these conversations over the last 10 or so years at the Kelley School at IU, where I'm an associate professor, business law and ethics, compliance, and corporate wrongdoing has really been kind of my focus. I'm happy to hear that people are listening to a little bit of what I have to say and are engaging with that work. But before I got to Kelley, I had worked at a couple different law schools. So I taught at DePaul Law School and at Chicago Kent Law School. And I was also a fellow at the Supreme Court for a year where I was essentially stationed in the United States Sentencing Commission. And so I was working on economic crime policy, sentencing policy. And then before all of that, before I joined academia, I was a white collar criminal defense attorney for about 10 years in Chicago. And that's kind of where a lot of this sort of my foundational thinking about individual wrongdoing, organizational wrongdoing started. And then I got to transfer all that and really explore it as an academic.
So that's similar to my father's career arc in the following manner. He went into, he's an industrial engineer and he went into industry. And then, for reasons he cannot even fully articulate, got interested in academia, went back and got his PhD, and then worked on the theory side of things for a while. And then through his consulting practice, was able to put those theories into practice in the world of labor arbitration and industrial justice. I hear a similar arc. Would that be a fair assessment of your career?
Yeah, I think when I was practicing, I'm not one of these academics that became an academic because they hated being a lawyer. I actually had a really incredible group of people that I work with, these great white collar attorneys in Chicago. If you know anything about Chicago, there's lots of white collar crime to go around. There's this great kind of community there of white collar practitioners, and I learned from some of the best. But what interested me the most about that practice was the educational side. When you'd have someone who is engaged in the criminal justice system in a white collar context that's usually for the first time. And so you're really educating them on what's happening and what's going to happen. But that also, at least I was always thinking in the back of my mind, like, why is this happening to this person? Like, how is it that they could do something either so dumb or why did they take this unethical step? And usually it was a step that led to a series of other things, often that resulted in illegality. But I was just really interested in that question. And so that kind of got me, I wanted to explore that more, and you can do that in an academic setting.
Could you tell us a little bit about the breadth and scope of IU's, not simply the Kelley School of Business, but the law and ethics components that you're a part of?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Tom, because I think it's kind of a underappreciated, understood group. So the Kelley School in the heart of Indiana University, top-notch business school, both undergraduate and graduate level. And we have this very, very unique group of business law and ethics scholars at the Kelley School. Right now we have, I'll get the numbers wrong because we grow all the time, but we have roughly 15 to 16 tenure track professors that teach business law and ethics topics, and then about the same amount of clinical and lecturer faculty. So we have almost like a mini law school size group of people at a business school who are teaching, writing, and engaging with the business community about all aspects of business law, including how companies can act in an ethical manner and how they can not only comply with the law, but be good corporate citizens all around. So it's a really unique place. And I'll also add that I just became the new director of the Institute for Corporate Governance and Ethics at Kelley. And then as part of that, we brought over this group from NYU called ethical systems, which is something that you may be familiar with, and some of your listeners are. Happy to talk about that. But the point is, there's a lot going on at the Kelley School related to business law and ethics, and it's an exciting place to be.
Tell us a little bit more about the institute, and then transition over to ethical systems and that becoming a part of the institute.
Yes, the Institute for Corporate, it used to be called the Institute for Corporate Governance. It was around for the last 5 years in the iteration before I took over. And it primarily focused on corporate governance, kind of mostly from a finance standpoint. And then I became the new director just this year. We just kind of had a big announcement right before Thanksgiving, and we've expanded the mission of the institute to cover business ethics as well. So it's now the Institute for Corporate Governance and Ethics, and we're really trying to think about corporate governance from a much broader perspective. So think about corporate law, certainly compliance, business ethics, sort of behavioral ethics and normative ethics, and then also think about financial controls. And so we're really trying to leverage the breadth that we have at Kelley. It's a big place. We have incredible academics and researchers across all these different disciplines, from accounting and finance to management, entrepreneurship, and certainly our group in the business law and ethics department. And so we want to think about corporate governance from a broad tent. And then at the same time, ethical systems, which has been around for 10 years. It was started by Jonathan Haidt, who has become really just this public intellectual at this point from NYU. And he was looking for kind of a new home for ethical systems, which is a group that is focused on the same type of things. How do we help companies be more ethical, but using kind of a systems approach, and primarily coming at this usually from a behavioral ethics approach. And so we brought ethical systems into Kelley, and it's going to be positioned under the Institute for Corporate Governance. And so we've just got this really kind of incredible now structure, but also an organization in ethical systems that's out there, that's really well established, and that's created a ton of great stuff and has this incredible collaborator network from all around the world.
Starting about 10 years ago, I had a dream to create exactly what you guys have done. So kudos. I've always wanted all of those different areas that in under the Institute's umbrella in one place with subject matter experts in each area, but obviously with a lot of collaboration and cross collaboration. So I can't wait to see what you guys come up with.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think you're exactly right, and I think this might bleed into something other topics we talk about, but I think that's how we should think about ethical practices in companies and how to foster that. It has to be truly a systems approach. It has to be one that covers all kinds of functional areas, because that's what business is made up of. I mean, that's how business people think of business. And so if we silo ourselves, we're never going to be as effective as we could otherwise.
I've been preaching process for years, and you guys have taken that about 10 steps further with the systems approach. So I'm all in.
Yeah, great.
Well, that really leads to the topic of behavioral ethics and its place in business ethics. Could you maybe start by explaining to us what are behavioral ethics and how do we look at it in the context of the workplace?
Sure. So behavioral ethics as a course of study is really looking at how people make ethical decisions and how the individuals, but also external actors, look at ethical decision making. So it's really trying to understand what are the processes by which people make decisions that have an ethical component. And so if you think about this as a field of study, I mean, it goes back, it's part of kind of this larger behavioral revolution that happened probably or kicked off. Some people would say in the 50s, some people would say in the 70s. I think behavioral ethics, using tools of behavioral science to understand ethical decision making, that's probably got about a 20 or year or so runway where a lot of the real work was started. But I think people in organizations, in particular people in compliance, for example, have really started over the past 10, 15-ish years to start to incorporate these ideas into how they're thinking about organizational wrongdoing and ethics in their employees. So it's really gained a lot of traction. And that's kind of the area that I draw on the most in all of my scholarship.
In this intersection, is this something that is literally imbued in a corporate culture, starting with the management and the tone they set? Is this something that flows from middle management or maybe from the ground up? Combination of all of the above, or maybe even none of the above?
Yeah, I mean, as you might imagine, it's a combination probably of all of the above. I mean, so one way to think about behavioral ethics and how it sits kind of in this larger umbrella or panoply of business ethics is we can think about business ethics from the academics call a normative standpoint. What ought we all to be doing? What's the right thing to do, if you will? That draws a lot on philosophy and that's a can be a conundrum in some ways, although I think there are some norms that most of us would accept. And particularly if we join an organization, we're saying we accept a lot of the norms that organization says it follows. What behavioral ethics does is says, okay, let's set that aside just for a second and let's actually understand like descriptively how it is that people make ethical decisions and then what's the behavior that follows from those. So it's a much more, in some ways, a more practical way of thinking about business ethics because it's trying to really understand what are the levers or the drivers of ethical decision making and behavior. And as we think about what are all those drivers, those come everything from internal processes, how the brain processes information, to social influence, how others around us and their behavior impacts what we do from an ethical standpoint. And so if you're thinking about as a manager, like where do those signals come from? It comes from everywhere. It comes from inside the person. It comes from the context in which those decisions are made. And it certainly comes from other individuals within the organization, whether it's your CEO, whether it's your middle manager, or whether it's quote unquote kind of line employee, what they're all doing. All of that is interacting in a way that's impacting individual ethical decisions. And then that, of course, leads to ethical or non ethical behavior.
The Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission started talking about financial incentives literally in the first decade of this year.
Yeah.
They have refined their thoughts over the years, and now they talk about financial incentives and consequence management, which I agree is an appropriate discussion because financial incentives do incentivize people. But in another respect, I see it as almost a hammer approach looking for a nail, meaning it's very hard and hits swiftly, but it really doesn't leave room for nuance. And maybe that's an unfair critique or even criticism, but it seems to me that we're not talking about a large part of the other things you're talking about. How do you see the role of financial incentives in either a behavioral ethics or a corporate compliance program?
Yeah. I think we would be wrong to excuse or discount the importance of incentives in anybody's behavior. Clearly, they're important, and there's a million examples of those. We have departments of economists. That's all they do is think about how that happens, and that economic framework is incredibly important to understand human decision making. Full stop. Okay. That said, there's this whole other aspect to this where you might be underappreciating how, say, a particular incentive is impacting employee decision making. Or you might discount certain things because it's not a strict monetary incentive, for example. So just I'll give an example that might marry the two. Loss or fear of loss drives a lot of behavior, right? Loss tends to impact us much more than a comparable gain would. That is theory and understanding from kind of behavioral economics and behavioral science. And so you might think about, okay, if I have a bonus or I'm going to give a bonus, that's a monetary incentive that's going to drive behavior. And what tends to happen in business is we focus a lot on that. Behavioral ethics might say, wait a minute, how might an employee who misses a bonus or had an expectation of a bonus, how might that impact their ethical decision making? Right. So if I feel like I got shortchanged because I didn't get the thing that I want, that expectation has created a potential behavior or decision making process that might allow me to rationalize bad behavior going forward. Right. This company doesn't care about me. If this company cared about me, it would have given me what I deserve, something like that. And so that could potentially lead to unethical or illegal behavior. And if you're a manager and you don't have an understanding of that goes beyond just the pure kind of incentive or economic incentive, you're missing part of the story and that creates risk in your organization.
What's the role of senior leadership in all of this, Todd?
Yeah. And senior leaders are incredibly important, both setting the stage and understanding if we're thinking about this from a kind of a behavioral ethics standpoint, understanding the context in which their employees' decisions are going to be made and understanding the context in which their own decisions are made. Right. So we can't set up a bunch of processes or organizational levers that are going to drive behavior one way and then look the other way or be surprised when employees take advantage of that. And so we want to think about, listen, the behavioral story here is let's think about how people are actually going to behave as opposed to what like a theory or an economic principle might suggest that they will.
Let's see, what's today? We're recording this on a Wednesday. Last week, we had the latest major corporate scandal involving McKinsey. Earlier this summer, we had the one before that, which was TD Bank and TD Bank America. Before that, we had a series of energy trading, bribery, and corruption cases, and they never seemed to end.
Yeah.
And we could pick a year and start there and go forward, or we could pick this year and just go backwards. How can we use these cases as lessons learned for the compliance professional?
Yeah. I mean, to me, I think the narratives around corporate wrongdoing get collapsed and simplified very easily. And this was in some ways, one of the driving factors when I transitioned from practice to academia. There's a narrative always about the greedy executive, right? Or the greedy company. And there is certainly some truth to that. But I think there's often a lot more nuance. And so you want to think about what are the behavioral drivers to what's going on here? If it's an incentive mismatch and that's the problem, then great. Then let's understand that. If it's one of a problematic culture, that's a whole different problem. They could certainly be related. And so we can try to solve that. Is it an individual or group of individuals that are influenced by something else that's going on in the organization? Or is it just an individual employee that started down took a bunch of small steps and rationalized bad behavior? The importance of those cases is to really dissect them and understand exactly what's going on. And then we as a compliance community, we as a business ethics community can start to pull out some real lessons. What I always have a problem with is oftentimes the lessons are just collapsed into, hey, this is a problematic company. Then let's either punish them greatly and that will fix things, or let's have kind of public outcry and that will fix things. It's almost never that simple.
Could I turn to spend a few minutes with you for some practical advice for compliance professionals?
Sure.
And what are some of the things I really like to give away, some tips that they can implement at little or no cost now that could lead to either bigger changes or longer term strategies?
One of the biggest drivers of decision making errors, there's this great quote that says, in order to get a wrongdoing or to get rid of wrongdoing, make an ethical decision, you have to have two things: time and lack of a rationalization. That's kind of one of my favorite starting points. So if you're a manager, you want to do a little bit of an audit about the type of things you're asking your employees to do. Are you giving them enough time to make decisions so they can actually consider what the ethical ramifications of this might be? And then are you catching and identifying any kind of rationalization or any kind of verbalized rationalizations by your employees? Those can be red flags that indicate that you've got either a problematic culture or you've got individuals that are comfortable crafting a story about why violating the rules is okay. So those two things together, they don't necessarily cost time. I mean, cost a lot of money, but they do cost a lot of creative thinking and making sure that you can actually have lack of rationalizations and adequate time in an organization in order to get the best possible context in order to make a ethical decision.
What's the role of training and communications?
Training is clearly important, but I will say I think training is often seen as kind of like the silver bullet or the go-to for any compliance problem, right? We have a violation or we have a new rule or law. The sort of knee-jerk reaction is let's do a bunch of training on it. Training only gets you so far because kind of what we know from behavioral ethics research is there's all kinds of different drivers to to decision making, and oftentimes it's happening in the moment. So when you're thinking about training, I mean, you're really asking your employees to understand laws and rules, kind of like a lawyer, care about those same laws and rules like a lawyer or compliance person would, and then put them into practice at the right moment. And that's a big lift for employees. So, what you'd want to think about a little bit more is what are the behavioral steps or what's part of the behavioral chain to the behavior you either want to encourage or discourage? And where can you influence that chain most effectively? So there's going to be certainly some front end training, but if you're relying on that as the driver of downstream behavior, there's just a whole lot of other stuff that's going to impact your employees' decision making other than that training. So we tend to overemphasize it as a fix.
Todd, I'd like to ask you a few questions about the book you co-author, Understanding White Collar Crime. Could
Sure.
you tell us the genesis of that book and a little bit about the fifth edition?
Yeah, so that's a book I co-author with Kelley at he's a law professor out in California, and we wanted to write kind of a desk book, a book that was valuable for lawyers, sure, students, but also compliance professionals. A black letter desk book, not a horn book, with a little bit more context and substance than that. We put together what I think is a really unique book in that way. No full cases, just excerpted cases, trying to tell you kind of what the cutting edge of different either black letter, white collar laws are, but also we've added a bunch of stuff about compliance and how compliance works. So just like almost like a desk reference that anybody could use if you want a quick understanding of white collar and corporate crime.
Todd, we've got a little bit of time left, and I want to end on a couple of different topics, although they're definitely related. The first one is the Boeing monitorship.
Yeah.
You wrote an op-ed piece, you and Wei Chen actually wrote an op-ed piece for the Washington Post about the court's decision to reject the DOJ and Boeing proposed settlement, where it might go. Where do you what's your take on that process as we sit here today in late December?
That's a good question. I don't know that anyone quite knows exactly where the Boeing monitorship, if it ultimately happens, or even the Boeing plea agreement, where it's going to go, because this has been a story with a lot of twists and turns. That's for sure. I mean, I think right now where it stands is the court has rejected the plea agreement. And so that means the monitorship is kind of up in the air. The point that Wayne and I were making is if it does happen, the court really has an opportunity, and I think us as people are interested in compliance and corporate enforcement and wrongdoing to really rethink how monitorships are selected and how they're practiced. Because there while there's been kind of a sustained, I would say, dribble, if you will, of critiques of monitors, there really hasn't been kind of a fundamental reckoning with what a monitorship actually should be doing and how that should occur. And so I don't know that's necessarily going to get hashed out in the Boeing because to be honest, I don't know if anybody's appetite in this new administration ultimately to enforce a monitorship, use monitorships like they were before. But Wayne and I were just trying to make the point that listen, with a case this size, you really have an opportunity, and we would hope that the court was going to take it, but the court went the other way and was interested in things like DEI and kind of entering the culture wars. So I'm not expecting that we're going to have that remake in this case.
I have publicly called this the most important monitorship ever and asked the DOJ to completely rethink their approach, although not in the direction or detail that you guys did. I would suggest to you that the court's ruling still leaves the door very open
Yeah.
for a rethinking of the monitorship and court oversight, which to me is what the court it seems most concerned about is the ability or not to have any either input into the monitorship process and oversight of it going forward. So don't give up hope yet. I think
Yeah.
we've got a long way to go.
And Tom, I'll just chime in on that. I mean, I think you're right. It's really interesting in that order. It's about 10 pages or 12 pages or something. Most of it's about the DEI provision. There's a page about court oversight, and that's actually the most important component of it. I mean, that's really where like the thrust of the critique of monitorships has been going back. If you go back to some of the first high profile monitorships in a Zimmer case in 2008, I think. And so I would love the court and I would love people to really fly spec that, understand it. And there were some innovations in the Boeing monitorship in how the monitor was selected, right? It was a new process, kind of this open RFP process. That was something new. And you're right, there are examples of that in other contexts where monitors are used, whether it's civil context, state context, where we could pull some best practices. I'm with you. I hope that this is kind of an opportunity to rethink that. I just don't know in this A, whether what the plea agreement's gonna look like, B, what the monitorship's gonna look like, whether the court truly has the appetite to do all this, and what happens after this, right? Will this be a new policy that's gonna be put in place? I think those are all unknowns, but I'm hopeful as well.
I would say very open questions at this
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
Could you just highlight for us the paper you wrote with Way that's, I think, scheduled to be published in Q1 of 2025? And I hope we can maybe take a deeper dive in another podcast on that.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, it's called Remaking Monitorships. Wei Chen, who was the compliance counsel expert, the first one at the Department of Justice, she has incredible wealth of knowledge about just the practicalities of monitorships. And so what we try to do is kind of put the theoretical and the practical together and take a first principles look at monitorships. And so there has been a lot of scholarly academic critique and there's been a lot of practitioner critique. And so we really wanted to kind of start from first principles and assess all those. And so we ultimately propose kind of a new office of monitorships. I think that is even more pie in the sky than a whole lot of wholesale changes. But really, what we're after is just kind of a rethinking about what truly is the goal of a monitorship and how we should think about effectiveness of that. And yeah, the article will be out in University of Illinois Law Review, and we're excited to get see what the reaction is.
Todd, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted to find out more about the Kelley School of Business or your work at IU, or maybe even connect with you, what might be the best place or places for them to go.
Sure. So really easy. You can Google Institute for Corporate Governance and Ethics at Kelley. That'll get you to the Institute page. I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find me there as well. And also my faculty bio, Kelley will kind of link all that stuff together. There's links that come out from there. My name's hard to spell, but pretty easy to find on the internet. If you just Google my name, I'll pop up.
You want to give any predictions for the football game this weekend?
I mean, listen, here's what I'll say. It's been a really fun year. It's been a super exciting time to be an IU football fan. I've only been here 10 years. We've been in the wilderness for quite a while. I know even way before that. So super excited. I'll predict an IU win, but just because I want that to happen. I don't know if I would bet on it, but I'm super excited to watch the game.
I remember watching IU in the Rose Bowl. That's how far back I go. And I can remember a guy I met who went to Baylor and they turned things around in the 90s and he was older and he said, I've waited 50 years for a year like this. I don't care what happens. And I think many IU fans have waited a long time for this in football.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now we just got to get our basketball, the team back on track here as well. And we'll be sitting pretty.
Todd, I wanted to thank you again for your time and I'm greatly looking forward to continuing this conversation.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Tom.